I'm Jonathan Curtis. I manage MetricStream's GRC solution practice that's focused on healthcare and life sciences. And for a fireside chat today, I've got a great guest. I want to introduce MK Palmore. He is the Field Chief Security Officer for Palo Alto Networks. His responsibilities at Palo Alto Networks include support of strategic accounts and continuing to provide thought leadership in the cybersecurity area. Prior to joining Palo Alto Networks, MK serves as the head of the cybersecurity branch for the FBI in San Francisco, capping a career of public service that spanned 32 years. His leadership and investigative experiences while at the FBI included cybersecurity, crisis response management, risk management advisory services, and counterterrorism investigations. MK's cybersecurity certifications include the CISM, CISSP, GCCC, and the Carnegie Mellon University CISO certification. He earned a Bachelor of Science from the United States Naval Academy and an MBA from Pepperdine. MK began his professional career as an officer with the United States Marine Corps. MK, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate being on. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for your service. My family is a military family as well, and we definitely appreciate sacrifices you made for all of us. MK, I want to start out the conversation today by focusing on, as Peter had mentioned in the introduction, certain types of cyber incidents that are bound to happen at some point in time, either denial of service attacks, internal identity spoofs, or data breaches. I mean, it's only a matter of time. I'm curious how you prepare for such incidents while maintaining operations as usual for other parts of the business.
Yeah, so Jonathan, you really kind of hit the nail on the head as you illuminated parts of my background. So my experience, of course, with the FBI was dealing with a lot of adversarial activity, and I think it makes you wary, but it also makes you aware as to why we're all in this business of defending enterprises. It's because adversaries out there are engaged in constant and persistent activity, trying to gain access to networks and environments so that they can get in, exfiltrate data, and of course, make money off of those illegal transactions. So, how you prepare for it really are, the use of best practices and frameworks that are available to all of us in the cybersecurity industry, and of course, the identification of best in breed and excellent tools that will enable your enterprise to enable the business and at the same time protect you moving forward. So. There's a ton of work, of course, that goes into it. I like to break it down into sort of a mathematical equation, right? I look at it as investment in practice, GRC, tools, everything else that you can stack on the left-hand side that amounts to preparation for an event, quite frankly, that you hope will never happen, but we all know just by the math and by the weekly notices of breaches that these things do happen. And so in an effort to remain resilient, the idea is to make heavy investment on the left-hand side of the equation, doing those things, again, across best practices, using frameworks that are available to practitioners in order to prepare your enterprise for what might happen someday. And the more you invest on the left-hand side of the equation, the better your mitigation is on the right-hand side when you're forced to react to these events.
Well, MK, that brings up a point about, how you prepare for these events. And one of the things that we're having a lot of conversations at MetricStream with our clients about is quantified risk assessment methodologies. And these have been on the horizon for a while now, and they're becoming more and more possible to practically implement. I guess what I want to ask you is, what has been your experience in operationalizing some of these methodologies, and how do you take these numbers focused, numbers driven risk analysis techniques and make them practical?
Yeah, so that's a great question. When we're talking about risk, we're talking about the probability of an event happening across a spectrum of events and the kind of impact that it might have on your enterprise and organization. And quite frankly, I have found over the years that these developing methods in risk analysis are very helpful in terms of explaining the dangers or sort of quantifying the challenge that we face as an enterprise when speaking to your colleagues who are outside of InfoSec, and also in those important briefings to the boards of directors where it's important to relay and quantify the risk associated with what you're trying to accomplish in terms of enterprise defense. People understand math, right? If you can quantify a number and give it a relational context, 28 out of 100 50 out of 100, if you can put some kind of quantification on it, and then people really understand where you are in terms of the depth of the program and maturity of the program, it makes it easier then to have conversations about what you need to do in the context of these frameworks that are available in order to level up the capabilities of the enterprise. One of the things that InfoSec suffered from in the early days was this lack of quantification, right? First of all, the terminology, just the experience of InfoSec wasn't clear to all of those who were impacted by it. We also suffered from the fact that InfoSec was not evaluated and considered an enterprise risk the way it is nowadays, at least I hope, across the board. And you had a challenge. You had to explain to non-technical people who held the budgets how it is that you intended to protect the enterprise. As we all know, the activities of adversaries began to increase exponentially. The conversation shifted and changed, and now we're to a point, again, I hope, where most enterprises view cybersecurity as an enterprise risk. In other words, it's racked and stacked along with every other risk that the enterprise might experience. And certainly in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis, we're starting to understand that our technology really is at the core of business operations now. And so if you're not paying attention to the risk that might challenge your operability, you're not going to be able to function when crisis hits. And so the quantification, again, as you touched on at the beginning with the question, it's very helpful. It helps explain the challenge that we're all engaged in, and it gives a framework to have a discussion where you can make those important asks for budget, resources, and other items, and then, again, be able to explain to your colleagues and others the roadmap that you happen to lay out in alignment, of course, with the business. And how it is that you're going to help enable the business get to where it wants to be. So these metrics are important, like everyone else, I like seeing when we take steps forward in terms of building frameworks and being able to discuss these things with our colleagues in real terms that make sense to folks.
Well, MK, thanks for that. I want to shift gears a little bit here because another one of the things that I'm having a lot of conversations with my clients about is just a ton of new regulations that are being mandated by governments around cyber resilience. A couple of examples. So the Department of Defense now requires all suppliers and contractors to adhere to CMMC starting this month. And then the EU Council has also approved a wide-ranging Cybersecurity Act that went into effect earlier this summer. It's adopted by all the EU member states. And what can organizations do to ease the compliance efforts for these new regulations and others? Certainly with my healthcare clients, they're facing a raft of new regulations that specifically are impacting their business in a very direct way. How can we be effective in these compliance efforts?
Well, the first thing is, I think, is to view it in the right context. Remember, compliance does not necessarily equate to effective security. It's important to note, I think, that these compliance standards as a baseline are absolutely necessary. So it's actually good to see some leadership at the government level when they establish these norms, when they establish these norms throughout certain industries. And it gives benchmarks, I think, for the security practitioners to practice towards in order to better enable their businesses. And of course, these compliance measures are based on the increased level of activity, again, we've seen from adversaries and the types of things that they do in order to gain entry into environments. And so it's a good note, I think. Again, we need as much leadership as we can get across the spectrum in the cybersecurity realm. Government certainly plays a role in that. But of course, it's the partnership between government and private sector that really levels up the ability of organizations to provide the kind of security measures that enterprises are going to need to protect themselves. So it's not a shock that governments set these standards for the enterprises to follow. One, if they want to do business with them, but even at much lower levels outside of the government, we see the need to, again, historically looking at breaches and things, we see the need to be able to levy standards on one another if we want to connect systems, if we want to enable businesses to operate. And so, again, I appreciate the leadership from a government perspective. There is a happy balance, right, or happy medium that we expect to see in terms of the compliance measures that are put on organizations, but as long as the private sector, I think, is participating in these conversations, again, that's where you get the integration between the two, public and private partnerships, so that we can align on what's best for the industry and also enable practitioners in the long run. So all in all, a good thing, but again, it's just a baseline. And if you're in compliance, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are hitting all the marks that you need to hit in order to both enable the business and protect it.
Exactly. So I want to touch on another topic that we talked about earlier, and that's enterprise automation and artificial intelligence. I mean, these things play a very important role in the overall cybersecurity program. But what's your experience in deploying AI and automation in your cyber risk programs?
Yeah, so a great experience with Palo Alto Networks. We've doubled down on our investment in automation and machine learning. And here's the truth of the matter. Adversaries have the same technologies available to them that businesses have in order to protect themselves. And we know that adversarial activity maintains heavy use of automation in terms of the attacks targeting organizations and enterprises. If they are using automation in their attacks, how is it that we expect a human sitting at the center of all of this to be able to correlate all of the information that's coming in from the various sources, your cloud posture, your endpoint, your network information? Putting a human at the center of it, of course, there should be a point where the human is engaged, making decisions, but there's a ton of work, a ton of things that can happen throughout the enterprise, and you can scale it through the use of AI and ML. So that protections, one, scale with the organization as it flexes its workforce. We're all now in this work from home mode or SASE mode, where the individual is at the center of all things in terms of access to business information, accessing information from all places, from home, on the go, wherever it is that they need to be. And we're seeing an increased access or use or need for access to this information. And so we have to really start thinking about information security in a different way. And at the same, while we expect humans to be engaged in nearly every aspect of the process, there's a ton that can happen before a human puts eyes on it. And so, again, organizations like Palo Alto Networks, the one that I work for, and others have seen this is where cybersecurity is headed. And so we need to make much more efficient use of AI and ML where we can. And again, as an organization, we've doubled down on that because we think that's where the industry is going.
MK, I want to go back to risk quantification and touch on that before we open this up to questions from the audience. But do you have any practical recommendations for security leaders or other organizations who are planning on incorporating risk quantification?
Yeah, make heavy use and reliance on the existing frameworks that are out there. I'm a big framework guy. I mean, maybe to my detriment. There are best practices. Our industry fellows and practitioners, people who really understand the deep technical side of cybersecurity, have established a of frameworks that allow us as practitioners to, again, have a roadmap to follow to enable our businesses and to engage in best practices that are agreed throughout the industry as ways of ensuring that you are in a position to both be resilient and to mitigate threats as they potentially enter your enterprise. And so these best practices, most practitioners are using them. I have my favorites, of course, that are out there, and ones that I use against enterprises, both small and I think about frameworks like the CIS 20 critical security controls, one where I took the extra step to dive a little bit more deeply into that and get a certification. I rely heavily on those types of things in order to frame and look at organizations to make an understanding as to, again, and going back to the beginning of my comments, how much investment an organization has made in terms of their security and where they've made those investments. And again, these frameworks give you a way to relate the gaps to your colleagues who are non-technical or non-InfoSec practitioners. You can relate gaps. You can show it visually. We all know that we actually, as humans, we learn best by visual data. So things like dashboards, things, again, like quantifying risk, putting it in a way that folks can digest and understand is really the best way to go about explaining the challenges that we face. And again, I'm excited to see, as new things come along, ways to go about quantifying those risks, and again, visually showing what the challenges are within a particular environment. where the challenges are, of course, to increase that visibility and to be in a position to both react to and proactively engage the threats that we know are out there on the landscape. So, lots of good things ahead, I think, for our industry.
Good, that's great to hear. So I definitely want to open up the forum for questions, and if you have any, we've got the capability, through the interface to take those. So, please send those in. MK, I just finished reading The Fifth Domain by Richard Clarke, and it really opened my eyes to cyber terrorism and everything that's going on, not just at a national defense level, but for the corporate level, and individuals too. Your experiences with the FBI, I'd love to sit down over a beer sometime and pick your brain about that. I'm sure there's a lot of unique experiences there that you're bringing to bear in your work right now. So definitely,
there are.
So I like to read, and I'm curious if you've got a reading list too. So examples like The Fifth Domain, for cybersecurity for the layman. Are there other examples of things that you might recommend there?
There is an absolute place that I will recommend that all readers go, both practitioners and non-practitioners, and that's the Cybersecurity Canon, which is a project that was initially started by my former boss at Palo Alto Networks quite some time ago. Palo Alto Networks was a plank holder in the Cybersecurity Canon, where a committee of InfoSec professionals annually ingested a number of books on the cybersecurity landscape, some technical, some non-technical, and published a list annually of the books that they recommended, and along with short digest of exactly what the book was about, what the author we thought was we're trying to accomplish. The Cybersecurity Canon, again, started by Rick Howard, fascinating. I recommend to everyone who is a reader of cybersecurity information that you go to the Cybersecurity Canon. You can Google it. It's now been taken over, I believe, by The Ohio State University, and they are now managing the project. But it was, again, brainchild originally of Palo Alto Networks, and I would highly recommend you go to the Cybersecurity Canon and check out the books there. None of us, unless you're Bill Gates, none of us can digest a book a day or a book a week, I think, the way that he does. What the Canon does is it lays out, here's the books that are must reads for practitioners and those interested in the industry. And of course, it goes down to the books that are, a nice to read, but maybe not a have to within the industry. So that's what I would recommend.
MK, that's great. I'm definitely going to check it out. So we did get a couple of questions from the audience coming in. So I'm going to start out with this one. So cyber risk quantification being an important aspect of achieving resilience, but we still don't see much adoption across industries. And this is per a Deloitte 2019 cyber survey, where half the C-suite executives responded that they use any quantitative evaluation, while the other half is saying it's largely dependent on a very manual approach. Do you have any rationale about why that might be, that really only half of the people surveyed in this particular example were using these quantitative approaches?
Yeah, and I think some of that's a holdover, again, from older practices. Again, these ways of quantifying risk as it relates to cybersecurity are relatively new, although the practice of risk quantification has been around quite some time. When you take those templates and put them over the cybersecurity industry, it gets to be a little difficult in terms of identifying methodologies. I think one of the more well-known models out there is the FAIR model, which is heavily utilized in industry nowadays. But the issue or the trick is, in terms of adoption, once folks become acquainted with a particular model and get comfortable with it, they tend to use it and take it with them wherever they go. So I think it's just a matter of time in terms of not mandatory adoption, but more wider adoption of particular risk assessment methods. And I think that as time goes on, and as the folks holding the purse demand more clarity in terms of the investments that enterprises will make, I think we'll see much more wider adoption of these things. We're already seeing organizations sort of pull back on their investments across the spectrum, of course, as it relates to the COVID-19 crisis. But as folks begin to realize that we need to be taking this time to shape how it is that we're going to come out of this crisis, they'll begin again to prioritize and look at where they're going to make investments. And I think risk quantification, again, is a good place to start, because it allows for you to have much wider conversations with your business colleagues when you can show visually, again, the gaps in your investment and your processes at a strategic level. And again, we all understand math. You understand low numbers and high numbers, and you understand where you fall on a particular spectrum. Everyone wants to overachieve, and you certainly you're underachieving. And when you can show that you're underachieving, again, set across a baseline, comparing yourself against others in the industry, it turns out to be a little bit of a push, I think, for the executives to make those investments where they need to.
MK, here's another question from the audience. How do I ensure that cyber risk is mitigated adequately and effectively in my organization? I have limited knowledge in ICT risk.
Yeah, well, pulling in expertise, looking for help within your ecosystem, heavy reliance on partners. Cybersecurity is a team sport. When I hear folks who think that they're engaged in this thing alone, and if you are alone, if you're a single individual or you have a small team, then it's more incumbent upon you, I think, to find out what other resources you might have to you in order to level up your capabilities while not overspending on the problem. And I think this is where the importance of partners comes in. You got to identify partners, not just, vendors out there who are trying to sell you things. You have to identify partners, folks who understand what your objectives are where you would like to be as a business, and then they help enable that process by making recommendations to you, not just of buying or consuming their tool set, else you might want to look again to level up capabilities. We're in the midst of a capabilities challenge here, not a tool challenge. So folks should be looking for platforms that are integrated, that allow them cost savings while at the same time leveling up their capabilities. We can't continue to go on the heavy spend of identifying a single tool that changes the matrix on a single problem. We need to be looking more efficiently at how we solve cybersecurity problems, and just going out and buying random tools to solve problems to integrate it is not a solution that's going to help us moving forward.
So MK, I think we've got time for one more question here. And I think we've touched on this a little bit already, but what are your recommendations for peers on achieving cyber resilience? How to start and from where to start? And also, what is the role of automation in enterprises' cyber resilience journey?
Okay, so to, again, quickly hit on the automation piece. I think that, as practitioners, we have to be thinking more efficiently about how we're going to solve these problems. We all know that the cybersecurity industry suffers greatly in terms of the shortages, in terms of the workforce. That's not a quick add water and turn around answer that can be given on that. We have to feed the system from the ground up in order to generate more folks that are able to engage. But until we get to that point where we have enough folks with the skills and the desire to engage in the industry, again, I think that there's going to be heavy reliance on automation and machine learning, and there should be, so that we can again level up capabilities and ensure that we're hitting the marks on where we need to be. In terms of going back to the first part of the question, how does one get started? One, educate yourself. If you're the leader of a team, start listening. Listen to not only what your team is saying to you, but listen to your colleagues about where the business is and where the business is headed, and figure out how you can align the objectives of the security apparatus along with the business, and then seek help where needed, right? I mentioned in the last question this idea of aligning yourself with partners. There are those out there, certainly my organization considers ourselves a partner to our customers. Find a partner that's really going to help you achieve your objectives. And the true definition of a partner is one that will, support your objectives as a business, not theirs. In other words, they come to the table with, hey, I'm going to sell you this tool. The first question they need to be asking is, what are your challenges and how can I help you fix them or solve them? And then the second part of that is, will tell you when you're on the wrong path and when you're on the right path. And they have the ability to say, at this point, maybe my organization may not be the best to help you with that particular problem, but I have a partner organization out there that I think you can plug in. And so you got to ask questions, you got to listen, you got to engage partnerships, you got to engage your ecosystem, and look for help. One of the challenging things that I find. And I talk to lots of customers, I talk to lots of practitioners, and the most disappointing thing I find is when I talk to a practitioner who at least appears to me that they got all the questions answered. None of us have all the questions answered. And if you posture yourself as sort of absolutely knowing the answer to all and not even willing to listen to input to others, then I think you're setting yourself up for danger in the future. So listening is a huge part of that, having those hard conversations, but again, identifying partners, identifying an ecosystem, help level up your capabilities and help you get to where you need to be as an organization.
MK, I'm going to hit you with one more question before we wrap things up here, and it kind of has to do with that same topic of how do you get started. Question is, how do we build risk quantification? But first, how do we identify concerned and applicable hazards? Maybe scoring?
Yeah, scoring, maturity models, I think, is a good way to approach those things. No one likes the answer when the maturity model answer comes back to you. If you're on a scale of 1 to 5 and your organization gets a 2, no one should be happy with those maturity model answers. But again, it gives you a framework and a roadmap from which to start from. And there's practitioners out there, folks who have sort of, I won't say answered the mail, but you as an individual and your organization will not have encountered every challenge out there. But if you're listening to your colleagues in the industry, if you're plugged into the right resources, if you're digesting threat intelligence, that's relevant to your industry, relevant for your enterprise, it really can level up your capabilities. And again, so I can't emphasize enough this reliance on others to help make your apparatus a secure one and a resilient one. So you got to look outward as you understand your needs inward. You got to look outward for help and get help where you can. And there's lots of free resources out there. Again, some standards and things, by OWASP and others, ISC Squared, SANS Institute, and of course the Center for Internet Security. These are where you can go, again, to see these frameworks, these best configurations, gold standards, to help you get started on your pathway to the resiliency.
Well, MK, thanks a lot. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. I think there's been a lot of valuable information that we've shared with our audience today. We're out of questions and out of time. I'm going to turn this back over to Peter, but MK, thanks again. Definitely appreciate it today.
Hey, thanks for having me.